Dear partners, dear guests, good morning in the name of Project Partner 6, University of Ljubljana, who was responsible for the working group of the thematic section 1, which was entitled Discovering Emerging Contaminants in the Water Environment, State of the Art. I would like to acknowledge also my co-authors, coming also from the same institution, Anja Torkar, Ines Widmar, and Mihael Brencic, who worked on the problem, collect data, and finally elaborate. So, what was our goal? What was our scope? We were intended to review state of the art regarding emerging contaminants, how to handle, how to monitor, how to treat, not only personal and pharmaceutical care products, but also emerging contaminants as a whole, in water resources management, as well as in drinking water treatment. You can find in literature and in the practical different views and approaches according to the emerging contaminants, of course, first of all, from scientific point of view, but also from political legislation point of view, monitoring, and nevertheless, also engineering. Our working group was divided into several subtopics represented with different outputs related to socio-political issues as well as technical and natural science questions. So how our deliverables were prepared? They were prepared based on the questionnaire, which was sent to all the partners, and partners later on sent also to the stakeholders of their country. This questionnaire follows somehow from the project proposal, but not only based on the project proposal, but it was based also on the analysis of possible interactions between water cycle and emerging contaminants as a whole. And in these questionnaires, we tried to understand various implications of emerging contaminants, not only scientific and technical, but also social economic implications, legislation, policy, management, governance. And I have to say that all the results which were obtained in the working group or working package were collective efforts and results of all project partners. So how we collect information of the state of the art of the emerging contaminants? We try to conceptualize this process on the different, let's say, compartments. So first of all, we focused on the definition of emerging contaminants, but emerging contaminants are very wide field and they are understood very differently. So first of all, we have to identify problems. Based on the identification of problems, we review monitoring strategies, but monitoring strategies are not enough. There should be also some type of analytical techniques. And we find out, of course, that there are many, not only one or two. When we have results of the monitoring and all the analysis, we have to have an idea what to do with this analysis. And so we also focused on the problem, what are the strategies to dealing with, and not only general strategies, but if there are or there is information about how to attenuate these concentrations which are found in the water environment. So as I said before, this preparation was based on the project proposal, because in this project proposal was already some definitions and some guidelines how to prepare it. And of course, we work on additional procedures of collecting available data and information. It was for us and also for the project partners and stakeholders somehow step-by-step learning process. And the procedures we have applied in our state of the art can be seen also as a learning tool for those who are working in similar projects or who are interested in the topics of emerging contaminants. So we try to embed it in our reports, also our experiences on collecting data. Let's start with the results. What are our results in the frame of state of the art? There are some graphs we have produced, and you can find them also in the reports. What are the most frequent words regarding emerging contaminants in our analysis? And it is interesting that it is somehow focused with the problems of European community and legislation about water. It is also interesting that there is no common definition of emerging contaminants. Even in the scientific literature does not exist, and even in national, approaches are not the same among different countries. And here you can see a graph that there is a different perception what is emerging contaminant. And for me as a hydrogeologist, it was also surprised that somehow even microorganisms are understood as emerging contaminants. Of course, there are several characteristics of emerging contaminants, and here we try to illustrate how they are related, what are characteristics of them. So, after collecting all information, we try to come to the final definition. This is definition we adopted in the project about what are and what is emerging contaminant. And we decided to define emerging contaminants represented a group of potential pollutants that are either newly created, newly identified, newly detected, or newly researched. So, what about further? What about additional information about emerging contaminants? There are some guidelines in European legislation, but according to the national legislators of all partners, there are considerable differences in research and monitoring strategies of each individual countries. And so consequently, there are also different classifications of emerging contaminants. And we try to understand what type of emerging contaminants are. So we find out that there are classifications according to the application of emerging contaminants. This is the main, let's say, but there are also many other classifications. So what are classifications? We find out, first of all, this is classification according to application. They are classified into industrial chemicals, pharmaceuticals, personal care products, biocides, and artificial sweeteners. These are classification which was found inside our group. But of course, there are in literature many others. So it is, how to say, somehow open classification about emerging contaminant application. What about different other classifications? These classifications are based on the sources of emerging contaminants from the chemical point of view. Then we have classifications related to effects of emerging contaminants. Another type of classification or types of classification are related to quantity and size. And there are also, let's say, open classifications, which are related to detection, quantification, identification, and of course, as it is always the case in the science, you have also classifications which reflects combinations of all these classifications. So, what are the sources of emerging contaminants according to our review? Of course, there are anthropogenic sources, which can be infrastructure, industry, agriculture, urban life. And in some reports, the emerging contaminants are also defined as substances appearing in nature. Of course, these emerging contaminants can, let's say, travel among different compartments, among different parts of water cycle. And here on the left-hand side, we have illustrated these relations, relation between drinking water, groundwater, surface water, then wastewater and wastewater treatment plants. And of course, this is somehow everything related to human. There are many different practices in sampling and in monitoring, and also in sampling procedures. There are many different experiences among the partners and among the states from where partners are coming. There are also different practices where they are monitoring these emerging contaminants. They are monitoring groundwater, in standing water, in flowing water, in springs, and different types of accumulations, which are artificial, of course. What about the policy? What about the legislation? Who are the factors who proposing the legislation and so on? Are there any voluntary guidelines and so on? So more or less, we can find out that emerging contaminants are still under some, how to say, guidelines and not so strictly defined under legislation. So if we compare this to the guidelines on the voluntary base, we can see here the diagram of the pie diagram, where we see that some countries, they have these guidelines and some not. Some are based only on legislation, but some of them are additionally built requirements and practices. We can find out also that legislation is defined for different types of water or water compartments. And also inside of this legislation, we find also different groups of emerging contaminants, which should be monitored and considered. Let's go to the conclusion briefly. In order to investigate possible long-term changes in concentration of different substances or changes in pollution in the future, it is recommended to continue collecting data on emerging contaminants in the aquatic environment. There is common understanding that emerging contaminants occur in the environment, but that they newly developed analytical techniques need to be used for this purpose. The analytical techniques always develop and changing, and we have to implement this into our procedure. There is a lot of open questions how to communicate, how to transfer this information to water policy, water management, and governance. And based on all this analysis and interpretation of collected data, the following recommendations can be made. Existing monitoring of aquatic environment must be upgraded with new emerging contaminants. So it means that we have to include in our monitoring procedures also additional substances. In relation to emerging contaminants, all aquatic compartments must be monitored. We find out that some of them are more frequently monitored, some of them less. And especially, more data are needed for wetlands and standing water bodies. And new up-to-date analytical techniques must be included into regular monitoring. So it is also needed better understanding of emerging contaminant ecotoxicology and impact on aquatic environment. A European and national legislation related to emerging contaminants must be updated based on the existing experiences. There is a gap in transfer of scientific and professional knowledge to legislation. And finally, understanding of socio-economic implication of emerging contaminants must be improved, especially how results of monitoring are transferred to common and wider understanding. Thank you very much.